And today I'm here to introduce you to Dave Snowden, the person who doesn't need any introduction, who helped us with the Cynefin model that we all are aware, and most of the Agilist here knows what it is and what we use every day. Dave, I'm sorry I did not have an introduction prepared for you because this was very last minute for me, and you don't need an introduction per se, right? So I will leave it to you to get started and let us know what we want to learn today. Thank you.
Okay. I'll just wait for the slides to go off the screen. Yeah. If people can keep their cameras on, it will considerably help me because then at least I can see some reactions. Yeah. So thank you for doing that. I have absolutely no objection to being interrupted, argued with, questioned, or challenged at any point throughout this presentation. So feel free to do that. All right. Just to give you by way of background, I actually started many, many years ago. I was 71 last week, so I'm starting to feel my age now. But I can still walk 18 miles in a day, so as long as I can do that, that's cool. But I remember when I was originally working in IT and designing decision support systems for large companies. And I had the advantage is I'd been a financial director, or rather a deputy financial director. And this is the days of 4GLs. So I could actually build what people wanted, not what they asked for. And that was kind of like a seminal lesson, I think, and it's still the case in IT, is that users don't know what IT can do. So they ask for what they actually remember from the past. They don't really understand the modern capabilities. I can talk later if you want about how we think we should be using low code and things like that to actually engage users more. But either way, so I was heavily involved in that. I started to realize that the sort of linear process involved in design, by which you have an architecture, you then capture user requirements, you then deliver the requirements. Yeah, it kind of like really didn't work, certainly in business applications. We used to produce entity flow diagrams and things like that, which were designed so that users would sign up to something they didn't understand, but we could hold them accountable for later. Yeah, so reality was actually a little bit different. And then I moved from coding to team leadership to business management to general management and then to strategy director over about 10 years, 10, 12 years. And we were starting to create a turnaround on the company, the thing which actually meant IBM bought us. And what I started to do then was to do several things. Is we realized that we were differentiated by RAD-JAD. Now, some people here are old enough to remember RAD-JAD. Most people in Agile have forgotten about it, but it had more discipline to it than most Agile methods. It was rapid application development and joint application design. Invented by IBM and developed in Canada, then ignored like IBM. Yeah, created in IBM and then ignored by IBM is a sort of badge of honor these days. I feel I'm in that category. SAP is in that category. So was Rad and Jad, right? And I was actually, this is going to be really important for what I'm going to come to at the end of this. I was convinced that we couldn't actually develop that because it was very new then. And people were used to traditional design. The focus was on year 2000 anyway. I still remember withdrawing Java with taking COBOL and Fortran out of my CV in 1992, but I knew what was going to happen to anybody, regardless of their management grade, if they could code in Fortran come the year 2000. But I knew that in order to get people to think about it, we couldn't have a single supplier solution. And Ed Holt was thinking along the same lines, and he pulled together myself, my equivalent in Logica. And you need to understand that data sciences and Logica were deadly enemies in those days. We competed on everything. So we got together in the pub in Cheltenham for an evening meal, and we created a DSDM consortium. Now, we're kind of like British. We don't need a ski resort in a week. Yeah, and we don't need an all-male community either. It was at least 1/3 female, but that's another question. And it was created between competitors in open source. And the idea is if we have a standard agreed by competitors, things will grow. Now, I think one of the problems which happened with Agile is we wouldn't have heard of Agile if it wasn't for Scrum. We need to be honest about this. XP was probably, to borrow Alistair's phrase, the heart of Agile, but as I keep saying to people on XP, the way they describe what they do is such that no ordinary mortal can understand it, and the fact they're quite proud of that is a problem. Whereas Scrum was at the right level of abstraction and codification, so that's Brasser's work, so it could scale very quickly. And the trouble is, it then created the framework for everything that came after, which is methods, tools, frameworks, certification, training, actually, rather than software development. Now, don't get me wrong, I think Scrum is one of the best method sets. I don't think it's a framework. I think it's a method set ever created in software development. Yeah, and I'll talk more about that later. But the trouble is, it then got locked into a series of framework wars. There wasn't a universal standard. Yeah. Everybody forgot about the DSDM element, which is one of the third, it was DSDM, XP, and Scrum that came together. And everybody forgot about the stuff we'd already learned. So to give you a couple of examples on that, one of the methods we've been resurrecting lately is a JAD approach. So if you don't know the way JAD works, is you bring users and IT people together in concentrated workshops lasting for a day to 2 days. Now, I took that and actually extended it. In IBM, we could produce best and final bids for $20 or $30 million contracts into 1.5 days. Because what you do is you bring all the people together in a very structured, very intense, highly orchestrated dance. And what comes out of that is far more effective than a linear process. So that's how JAD worked. And I used to go into the IT groups and say, who have you got who's a brilliant coder, but you wouldn't trust on a project? And lots of people could give me people in that category. And those are the people I use because they got bored very quickly, but they were brilliant at producing prototypes. Yeah, so they could throw to something very quickly. Whoever just did that, could you please undo it? I want to see people, not see myself. Yeah. So if you could unspot me, please.
Going to do that. Give me a minute, Snowden.
Yeah.
Just 1 second, Dave.
So to come back to the point, so what we started, so and we did that. So we started to do everything in that approach. So 1 or 2 days, and then we had a massive defense contract, and I had to run about half a dozen different JAD sessions over multiple projects. Yeah. Yeah. So I'll get it there. Okay, I'm back to where I want to be, so I can see everybody. Right? And we just couldn't do it in the time available. So I started to run them in parallel over 3 time zones. So we'd run a JAD for 8 hours in the UK, then we'd pass the results on to Mumbai for 8 hours, and then pass on the results to the Valley, to San Jose for 6 hours, pull the result back the next day. And that was quite useful. It brought diversity. And then one day I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning and realized I'd forgotten to send on the requirement. Instead of sending them the pack, which was the original user requirement and the results of the first JAD session, I just sent them the results of the JAD session, but nobody had any idea why we were doing it. Either way, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, it's too late. I just go in the next morning thinking, oh shit, I'm going to be in real trouble this morning. And all the users were gathered around the screen going, oh my God, that's wonderful. Can we have that? We would never have thought of it. So I claimed it was deliberate, all right? The essence of good strategic management is to use serendipity strategically. And what had actually happened is it had gone to India. The Indians basically said, okay, we haven't got requirements. Let's see if we can improve it. The Americans complained that they hadn't got what they expected and maybe they shouldn't be expected to work. But the Indians said, we did it, can't you? And that kind of like worked in motivational factors. And what we'd done effectively was introduce mutation. So we'd started off with a requirement. We'd sort of thrown that together with the users. It was different from what they came in with. But then 2 separate groups played with different outputs and produced things that nobody could have thought of and nobody would have thought of if they'd been constrained by the original requirement. And that's actually a formal method. You can find it in Cynefin.io. It's an open source method. It's called 888. Yeah. It's one of the several methods we got, which are kind of like pre-Scrum, yeah, in Agile components. And I'll say this up front, a lot of my focus is how do you increase the interaction between users and IT people at a very fine level of granularity, something I'm going to come back to in a minute. Yeah. Finely grained things can combine and recombine in novel ways. Coarsely grained things can't. And most user requirement specs are coarsely grained. Most software architecture is coarsely grained. So it's very restricted. It's an adaptive capacity. That's going back to the raw science. So yeah, that was my background. IBM then bought the company, which was a scary 48-hour experience. On Friday, we thought we were floating on the stock market. The next Wednesday, I had 3 companies I was going to buy with the process. And on Sunday, we were sold to IBM. And I still remember we invoked our right not to be bought by IBM, and the venture capitalists then told us what they would do if we invoked that right. And we realized, we had no rights whatsoever. We had to do what we were told. Either way, IBM decided I was a creative. So they gave me a brief which lasted for 7 years to do whatever I wanted, provided it annoyed the right people, which is something I'm actually quite good at. My bonus scheme in my second year, because HR, my boss, who was a really good guy, Philip Oliver, he used to get his reportees together at the end of the year and retrospectively write their targets. He understood complexity intuitively. You can't work out, and HR caught him at this and told him he couldn't do it anymore. So my targets for that was I got 10% of my bonus scheme for every vice president of IBM who demanded in writing I was fired, and 5% for every director of IBM who demanded in writing I was fired. And HR went ballistic with him, but he pointed out that with the acquisition of data sciences, which was to create IBM Global Services, the strategy says senior people in IBM will be deeply disturbed by this. We have to protect people so they're not submerged into the IBM culture. So he said, this is a strategic objective, it's immeasurable, and I've got the authority to do it. They never, ever asked him to set targets again after that, didn't they? But I hugely overachieved on that target in 3 separate payments from Ginny Rometty, who went on to be CEO, but that's another story, right? Either way, I'm just giving that background because that's the sort of background on IT I'm coming from. Now, when I got into that research role in IBM, which lasted from when I was 43 to 50, both my parents died in the year of my 50th birthday, and IBM basically decided we'd succeeded in a way which wasn't the way they wanted us to succeed. We were one of 6 emergent business units. We were the only one to succeed, and we were the only one closed. There's a story behind that if anyone wants to hear it later. Either way, I left IBM on my 50th birthday. I took an early retirement package and set up what is now the Cynefin Co. Yeah. And throughout that period, the focus was to use natural science to understand social systems. My background is a mixture of theoretical physics and philosophy, which means I have a philosopher's delight of argument and a physicist's contempt for social scientists. Yeah, they never have enough data to form any valid conclusion whatsoever. And we used to say they have physics envy, which was a deliberate play on words. And I will say that management consultants and generators of agile methods are even worse. I mean, I've seen agile methods created by somebody reading an airport book summary of cognitive neuroscience and then creating a certification in how to approach a cognitive neuroscience approach to, just don't think me there, right? So we take a different approach. So complexity theory is one of the key things. And what I want to do now is basically go through 3 sections. And I'm going to do this fairly quickly so we've got time for questions. One is give you some 101 stuff on complexity. Secondly is talk about Pagoda, which is effectively an acronym which we just created to help people understand how you manage complexity. And finally, talk about the Hexi initiative, which is applying complexity principles to how do we break the framework wars and how do we actually regenerate Agile on a multi-vendor, multi-method, multidisciplinary basis. Yeah, so I'll talk about that at the end. Yeah, so that's the plan. So at this point, I need to see if sharing slides work, which is a 50-50 thing. Yeah, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Keynote. That's interesting. It's not letting me share anything. Including that, I think you need to give me permission, guys.
You're as co-host, so that shouldn't be the issue. Let's see. What is it saying when you go to share?
Let's put a big no entry sign up. Okay, that may be my settings. All right, because it won't let me do it unless I quit, so I'm not going to do that. So you'll have to rely on hearing me speak, which is fine, right? I think, yeah. What I'll do is I'll put a couple of images into the comment channel so people can look at them when I get to that. So let me go 101. So I titled this talk Think Anew, Act Anew. If you don't know, that comes from a speech by Lincoln 1 year into the Civil War. And I'll put the actual quote in there, if I can. Help if I spelt it properly. So what he basically said, and the key phrase I want to pick out on this, remember this is during the Civil War, which tore America apart. We may be an equivalent period today, but that's open for conjecture. He said, as the times that are new, we must think anew and we must act anew. Now, the key point on that is think differently and act differently. It's not one or the other, it's both. And that's really what I want to emphasize. So part of the thinking on this is to understand complexity, and the essential feature of a complex adaptive system is that it's deeply entangled. Everything is entangled with everything else. If you want to keep this really simple, the Latin origin of the word complicated is something which is folded, and something which is folded can be unfolded and folded again and it doesn't change. The Greek origin of complex is something which is entangled, and something which is entangled can't be unentangled and tangled again, which actually means complex adaptive systems have very high what's called path dependency. You can never start from scratch if the system is complex. To use an architectural metaphor, you never get a greenfield site. Therefore, anybody who comes in and says we'll design an IT system from scratch basically doesn't understand complexity, because you can't. You actually need to map the existing system and map the existing capabilities. Now, I'm not going to do that now, but probably the biggest framework I think I've ever created is actually not Cynefin, it's Estuarine. Estuarine has gone to the level Cynefin had over 10 years in 2 years. And what Estuarine does is it maps the energy gradients of the present. And it basically says, until you understand the energy cost and the time cost of change, you shouldn't attempt any change anyway. And it's a simple 2 half-day process. It's well documented. You can look it up. Now, the key thing of Estuarine, so Cynefin is a decision support framework. Estuarine is a complexity framework, and that's important. Yeah, Cynefin uses complexity, but it's not confined to complexity. Estuarine is all about complexity. And in a complex system, there are only kind of like 3-4 things that you can manage. So there are 3 necessary but not sufficient conditions for a phenomenon called emergence. And emergence is the key thing which defines complexity. It's the properties which arise which can't be attributed to the properties of the parts or the parts interactions. Yeah, so in a complex system, you have emergent properties that can't be predicted. So to take an example, anybody who talks about an agile mindset, apart from being a con person, really doesn't understand the way this works. So behavior is an emergent property of interactions over time. Defining the behavior you want won't achieve the result unless the behavior has become habituated over 4 or 5 years. Yeah, so basically changing interactions is the way you change mindset, not by telling people what mindset you want them to have. And that will come through in some of this at the moment. Yeah. So yeah, you can manage what are called the 3 necessary conditions. One is you have to have a lot of what are called actants. Now, actants won't be familiar to some of you. This comes from actor network theory, which is Latour. It's the concept that not only humans have agency, physical things can have agency. All right, so whereas all actors are actants, not all actants are actors. And we look at actants from 3 perspectives. One is actors, which is people or roles. The other is constraints, and constraints either contain things or they connect them. If they contain things, it's probably ordered and complicated. If they connect things, it's more complex. Yeah, but you haven't got boundary conditions. And then this key concept from physics called constructors. And a constructor is something which transforms things, but doesn't itself change in the act of transformation. So in software development terms, that's what an object is. Object orientation is really close to complexity theory, and I don't mean microservices by that. It's a ritual, it's a process. It's something which actually provides continuity over time, but transforms things as things pass through it or become proximate to it. Yeah? So what we have is a thing called the actant triangle, which is actors, constraints, constructors, and we try and identify everything which is going on in that place. That's the basis for Estuarine mapping. But can we come back to complexity? You need a significant number of actants. You then need very rich, very local interactions. And the third one, which I always enjoy telling people, is none of the actants must have knowledge of the whole. So if anybody says we should think holistically, not only are they fundamentally in error, but they're going to destroy emergence. Because you pervert the system based on who's got the most power. If you look in nature, nature optimizes without a directing intelligence because it actually generates emergence. And there's stuff we're doing on that at the moment. So you need lots of actants, you need lots of rich local interactions. You then need to monitor for patterns, and if there's a good pattern, you give it more energy, and if there's a bad pattern, you give it less energy. Yeah? And you can make actors or any actant can be made so structured that it forms what's called scaffolding, which means it's not going to change and you can rely on it. A scaffolding is a broad concept in evolutionary biology. I'm not just talking about steel scaffolding, I'm talking about lots of things. Yeah. So that's called the Ames framework: actants, interactions, monitors, and scaffolding. Now I can modify the actants, I can modify the interactions, I can create monitors, and I can create scaffolding, and that's all I can manage in a complex system. Everything else is a waste of time. So in modern software design, you design the scaffolding, that's where architecture needs to go, and scaffolding can be partly emergent. And then applications are emergent properties of the interaction of software and people around the scaffolding. We're just finishing off work in which people are objects too. So you can have a combination of roles which has standardized input-output, which is polymorphic, which has inheritance, and you can put a people object into a software design to handle anything which is ambiguous, and then don't code what those people do until it's stabilized into patterns. That to me is one of the things I'm most excited about in terms of what we're trying to do at the moment. Yeah. The other big thing to understand about a complex system is complex systems don't scale by aggregation or repetition. I remember the first time I ever saw the SAFE diagram was in Novi Sad, which is quite a profound place to lecture if you're British, by the way, because British planes came in and committed a war atrocity during the, yeah. So Novi Sad is a special place, all right? And I remember seeing the diagram and basically saying, that's just wrong. I wrote a blog post very quickly after it called The Infantilization of Management, which is still quite popular today, because you don't scale by aggregation. It's fundamentally flawed. Yeah, you scale by decomposition and recombination, but you can't predict the results of the recombination. This, by the way, is very important in peace and reconciliation and bringing different ideas together. Don't try and force them together at a coarse lane of granularity. Decompose them till there's no dispute, and then recombine them. Yeah, we're looking at that at the moment on systems thinking and complexity. It's a key part of Estuarine. Keep breaking things down till you're agreed. Then you're at the right level of granularity. You know what you've got, and then allow things to recombine and spot the good patterns which emerge from it. So that's the fundamental complexity principle. You come later. So that leads me on to Pagoda. This is actually a case where ChatGPT will actually prove quite useful. Creating acronyms is actually quite difficult if anybody's ever tried to do it. Yeah. So I put it into ChatGPT. I've got these 8 letters. Can you create a word from it? and it created lots of nonsense words. And I said, well, you can drop one letter, and then it came up with Pagoda, and the letter it dropped is F, which was for fractal. And a pagoda, of course, is a fractal structure. So that was perfect, right? So it stands for, effectively, I'll run through them. P is for proximity. Remember I talked about very rich local interactions? We don't respond, either humans or anything in nature. We respond to things which are close to us, not things which are far away. So people responded quite well to COVID, but they're not prepared to make the same sacrifices for climate change. It's too far away. Yeah. Some of our work on peace and reconciliation, I say I've just come back from Ukraine, which was an interesting experience. Yeah. The pictures drawn by victims of Russian torture are going to stay with me for the rest of my life, but they're, very brave people. And one of the things that you start, and I shouldn't have got into that because I've forgotten where I was going with that. Okay, so one of the things that we're working on peace and reconciliation at the moment is if you put people who hate each other together in a common task, they start to realize the other person is a human. I did that for the first time in the 70s in Northern Ireland. So we had Corrimila, which was get everybody in the room and get them to agree they should be nice to each other. Facilitators love that sort of stuff because they get their rocks off on it. Yeah, everybody loves the workshop, but then nothing changes. We took asymmetric groups of Protestants and Catholics and we dumped them into the slums of Rio de Janeiro on an ecumenical project for 3 months. And we didn't talk about the troubles. And they discovered pretty fast they had more in common than they realized. And they talked about their political and religious differences in their own time without facilitation in the context of working together. Now, I've done that in company change programs, and we're currently doing it in Germany around the elections, and we're also starting it in the US, is bringing people who think they hate each other or think the other person has nothing in common and get them to work on a completely different area than their actual problem together for a period where they've got that in common. That's the best way of doing things. It's also, by the way, more ethical, yeah, because they make their own judgments. So proximity really matters. Secondly, anomalies. This is Clark and others people's work. Yeah. And this is important to realize. It's why I don't like terms like mindset or mental models, because they're bad science. Your brain makes very few of your actual decisions. Most of your decisions are made by your body and your social environment. Yeah. And mindset becomes a way to blame people. Oh, we had an agile change initiative or an agile transformation initiative. It didn't work. Well, you guys didn't have the right mindset. It's all your fault. Yeah. It's a sort of Freudian guilt, which is where it all comes from in the first place. So as I say, the brain only actively engages when you see an anomaly. So most of the time you're doing what's called autonomic processing. You pull your hand away from a fire without thinking about it. Yeah. The brain fires after the event, and idiots like Richard Dawkins and Susan Blackmore say that means you haven't got free will, but that's because they assume the brain has to direct all body actions, which is not the case. The brain fires after the event because it's double checking if the automatic response worked or not. If it doesn't work consistently, it will engage what's called novelty receptive processing, which consumes a huge amount of energy, so it doesn't do it unless it really needs to, and then the brain makes a decision. Yeah? Now that's important to realize, because if you want people to think differently, you've got to create anomalies. One of the most effective things we do, and we just launched an Agile Quick Sense with Comic Agile for this, and one of the things it can do is, because everybody contributes a story about what's happening in Agile in the company, we can basically say, well, managers see it like this, employees think it'll see it like this. They've been through exactly the same process, so they can't challenge the results. Yeah, and that's important. And so what you've done is you've created an anomaly. If you create an anomaly, people think about problems differently. Yeah, so anomalies are really important in complexity. We then get granularity. I've talked about that a lot. Smaller things will combine and recombine very quickly. Bigger things are more stable. Yeah, but they won't change. Obliquity, I've talked about that. There's a wonderful book by Kay on this, which goes through all the cases where human beings solve problems when they stopped trying to solve the problem and thought about something else. At some stage in your life, you all said, I'll sleep on it. If you're sleeping on something, you're engaged in a highly contective neuro task, which involves short-term, long-term memory, and God knows what else going on. If a computer or an AI system is sleeping on something, it needs to be rebooted. Yeah, it's kind of like a different sort of process. Yeah. So that obliquity principle is key. Disintermediation. Our work, for example, where we produce requirement specs using narrative databases rather than structured documents, means that coders can look directly at clusters of user narratives without it being mediated or interpreted by a systems analyst with all of their biases. The work we do at government level is to allow governments to go directly from an abstract representation, which can have millions of stories in it, and read a story told by a constituent without anybody interpreting that first. Yeah, so disintermediation is a very important principle. And if you haven't got it by now, I'm totally opposed to user requirement specifications because they overstructure and overcodify too quickly in the process. There are better ways of doing it. And finally, what's called abduction. So there are three forms of reasoning: deduction, induction, abduction. Deduction is if A, then B. Abduction is all the cases of A have B. Yeah, so we can assume there's some correlation between the two. You have to be aware of correlation and causation. My favorite example on that is if any country here wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes it wins, all it has to do is increase the consumption of dark chocolate. You don't need an educational system. Dark chocolate consumption per head of population directly correlates with Nobel Prizes per head of population for the last 50 years on a bigger data set than you will see in any social science or management textbook. So go and eat chocolate. The one which I think is true is peaks in attempts to commit suicide by drowning have directly correlated with the release of Nicolas Cage movies for the last 20 years, but I can see a reason for that, right? So inductive logic is very powerful, but you have to be careful. And remember, AI is purely inductive. It's dependent on its training data sets. Human beings are abductive, known as the logic of hunches. We use art and abstractions to make completely novel connections between things. We evolved to make decisions without training data. And we're just in the middle of launching a major project, which will culminate in the States in November, looking at, can you audit the divide between human and machine intelligence, and can you monitor whether you are losing abductive capacity by overdependence on AI? And if you haven't seen it yet, the evidence is now pretty overwhelming that extended use of AI destroys cognitive capacity in humans. Yeah, because it becomes a prop. Yeah. So that's Pagoda. It's a simple checklist. That leads me on to what we're doing with Hexi. So remember I talked about how do we, the way we actually work with an environment, complex system scale, by aggregation and deaggregation. Sorry, just need to change the chat because it's saying I'm talking to one person individually, not the whole group. So what we started, and I originally did this work in IBM, but then brought it back in, is what we're doing, and you can all sort of have a look at that picture, is we've taken our own methods and tools. Scrum.org is now complete and will get launched for sale shortly. We're working with team topologies. We're working with Flow Consortium we're about to release. Is we're taking standard methods and tools and breaking them down into their lowest coherent element. And those go on to hexes. If you want to know why that's useful, then look up hexagons are the bestigons on the internet and watch the video. Yeah, it's a great video. Hexagons combine and recombine in novel ways, not structured ways. Yeah. So what we're doing is it allows you to take methods and tools from multiple vendors and peel one method out. So for example, I could take Scrum, I could peel out Sprint and replace it with a time box. Right, start to get the concept. So instead of saying I've got to set the whole of a method, I can take bits and pieces of different methods and put them together in different combinations. And what you see there is a combination of methods from 3 vendors. Yeah. And we've launched this as an open source initiative. It's not proprietary to Cognitive Edge. Our methods and tools are branded Cynefin Co, but the overall Hexi brand is independent and it will go into common ownership fairly soon. Yeah. Now that's actually quite important. It has transparencies, it has facilitation kit. There are 3 different approaches to software. We didn't want to be exclusive on that, so you can just use a Miro board if you want. Ivor Jacobson has been doing work with his approach, called Essence, and we're about to launch a version of SenseMaker by which you can move and match hexagons around on a workspace and store them as an assembly, and other people can sell you an assembly, and then you can slightly modify the assembly. Yeah, so start to get the principle here. Is break it down, combine it, recombine, learn from the recombinations. That's one of the areas we'll use AI. Now, to me, this is where Agile has got to go. Agile was always wrong because it tried to say that waterfall was wrong when waterfall is completely right in some circumstances. I remember working with Telstra once, and nobody got promoted unless they were Agile. But they were doing public transport, public infrastructure projects. So they created 1-year sprints so they could say they were Agile. Yeah, and I don't blame them. I mean, that's the game you have to play, all right? I really feel sorry for companies when their company adopts SAFe and they're forced to, play the game on that, all right? And SAFe for me is the antithesis of Agile. And by the way, one of the things we're doing with Hexi is we're launching a safe recovery kit. Because IT directors have invested a huge amount of money in SAFe, so they daren't admit it would fail. I mean, that was Dean's genius. He realized if people spent that much money, it would never fail. Because what we're saying is, well, SAFe was an entry level to Agile. Now you know it. Pick the hexes for the methods you actually use, because there isn't anything in SAFe which doesn't come from other vendors anyway. And then say what you're going to change and how you're going to move forwards. So that's me being nice to IT directors who spent millions of dollars on something which wasn't worth anything in the first place. Yeah, but that's life if you're a C-level. Yeah. So that's the latest initiative. Yeah. And at that point, I'll sort of, kind of like, this is thinking anew, it's acting anew. It's in a world of inherent uncertainty. And I really want to make this point. You have to manage the present, not the future. Yeah, you can understand where we are, but actually predicting the future is wrong. I've just written a major book chapter, which basically says foresight is the wrong term. We need to think about forethought. And Napoleon Bonaparte famously says we can have forethought, but we can't have foresight. So that's about doing things in the present which reduce risk in the future, not by trying to predict what the future will bring, because that's going to you're going to get that badly wrong. Yeah? So that's part of this body of work. Yeah? And by the way, this all comes from the EU Field Guide on Complexity. So I'll put a couple of links in the thing. That was a co-production of the Cynefin Centre and the European Union. And I updated it recently in a new book on foresight. And that's the link to the book. There's a book chapter called Through a Glass Darkly. My mother she was a good atheist, but she made me read the whole Bible before I was 11. But she said I'd never understand European literature without knowing my Bible, and I punished her by becoming a Catholic when I was older. Yeah. But you'll see that come through. So Through a Glass Darkly is a wonderful quote from St. Paul, which to me summarizes what foresight is about. Yeah, we can't see clearly. All right, so that's an update on the field guide. Okay, I've left 15 minutes for questions, comments, disputes, arguments, anything anybody wants.
Dave, let me just first jump in. Thank you so much for this amazing session. People have been asking privately in the chat if you would share your slide deck with us, because we had...
I'll send that on to you.
Thank you, appreciate it. And for those who asked me, we will share it in the meetup space. Thank you. If you could raise your hands and we can give everyone a chance to ask questions. Thank you, Ryan. Go for it.
Yeah, thank you for interesting talk. Where would I get more background on some of the ideas you talked about today? I just looked on Amazon, and there's a book called Cynefin, Weaving Sense Making into the Fabric of Our World.
They conned me into writing the introduction for that, and I had no control of the rest of the content, but it was given to me on my 65th birthday. All right. So yeah, that's one. We're actually producing the Cynefin field guide at the moment. I've got 2 pages left to write, and that will be announced shortly. So that's defined to be the definitive statement of Cynefin. If anybody's interested in the sort of micro narrative stuff, then we just launched something with Comic Agile, in which we present 6 Comic Agile cartoons to the workforce. They choose the cartoon which represents the state of Agile. They tell a story, they index it. And then we can draw maps which show you the attitudes to Agile. So that's a link to that. Yeah. And by the way, that's also designed so independent consultants can create their own offerings. Yeah. And we got another one on AI, and there's a lot on the website. Yeah, we train, but I mean, I lost 2 members of staff over this. 3 years ago, I said, we're putting our methods open source. We're not making them proprietary. And I think, it was interesting. They didn't understand strategy. We've put a lot of effort. We've probably created the complexity market, to be honest. Yeah. If you do that, when the market takes off, you make everything open source fast. You don't try and lock it in. If you lock it in, you'll create deadly competitors. You want other people copying you. So say we went open source completely on methods. That's Cynefin.io. Yeah, and you can find that.
We have another question here in the chat from Oscar. Oscar, if you'd like to come off mute and ask it yourself, or I can read the question here for you.
How would they? Well, I think just let them do it for a few times, right? I mean, when I was 11, I was 14 years old, and I had a home chemistry kit, so I ordered every chemical from the catalog using somebody else's money. And when my father, who was a veterinary surgeon, discovered some of the chemicals I now had in my bedroom, things went slightly nasty, all right? And I learned my lesson. So I think there's a learning lesson, but we primarily see what we think will happen is assemblies. So we think experts, and you guys are some of them, will say, well, actually, if you want to do X type of project, I think you should use these methods and tools in this sequence and this combination. So they can create that in the software, store it as an assembly. Other people will find it with an AI and they can say, well, I like that. I'll use it as it stands, pay a royalty, or they can modify it a bit. So I think assemblies is the right unit for that. And that's where we're going. Yeah. By the way, we're talking about if anybody's going to the Agile conference in Budapest in June, I think it is. Nigel Thurlow and I and Kent are all there, so it will be talked about there quite extensively. Let's show you. So that is a Hexi kit. Yeah. So that's our methods and tools. It comes with a set of transparencies that you can overlay. And then these are the actual cards. So they have indications of difficulty on the back. You'll see they've got a QR code. You scan the QR code, it takes you to the wiki, which is the up-to-date version with full instructions. Yeah. And so those are virtual now as well as physical.
Thank you, Dave. We have Ram here with his hand raised. I think he has a question for you.
Actually, I was just looking at the Handbook for Future Studies link, and most of that content seems to be locked. Is there a way to actually get access? Mine
is unlocked. If you
go I see.
through a glass dark, you'll see that's open source.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Open access, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Karen, please go ahead.
All right, David, I'm going to work through this. You said that behavior must be habituated over 4 to 5 years. And you also said that your brain makes very few of your actual decisions. Most decisions are made by your body and your social environment. So what is habituating those behaviors? I mean, environments are created by people, I guess, in processes. So that's my question.
Okay, so let's take an example. So tomorrow I'm going up to the cybersecurity show in Birmingham, and then going on to Hull University for my annual encounter with systems thinkers, which I enjoy, right? Then I'm going for 8 days walk in the Lake District. Right? I was on mountain rescue when I was young.
You were what?
I was on mountain rescue when I was young.
Okay.
All right. I know how to pack a rucksack. I know how to pack a rucksack so I can survive for one night in adverse weather conditions. I know to carry locator beacons. I know to carry map and compass, and I know how to use them. Every 3 months, I walk without sat nav so I can maintain the skill. All of those are deep-seated habits which arose over many years, which actually have causality. So I have a safety mindset in the mountains, but it wasn't because somebody gave me a slide set to tell me what a safety mindset was. Yeah, it was because I made mistakes. I lived in the environment. I worked on it. So, I mean, and to be quite honest, I think most of us are feeling really sorry for people who've invested all their time in behavioral science, because it's largely discredited. Nudge theory has been discredited if you look at the literature, because behavior isn't causal until it's highly structured and highly habituated. Interactions and physical change is really important for humans. There's a whole body of things we can only know by doing them. This is called embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended, right? Which is new theories of consciousness. So the idea that the brain directs things, and it's why OD has got a real problem, because it's still stuck with Freud and Jung. And why people are still working with 19th century psychologists who abuse their patients in the context of modern science, I do not know, right? We now know that most human intelligence is actually social. Yeah. So the social environment in which, and this actually endorses Denning, by the way, the social environment, the business environment you put people in has far more effect on them than any attitude or mindset they have. Yeah. So changing that matters. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And how do you address the fact, you also said that your group was in IBM was the only one who succeeded and they let you go.
Yeah.
So how do you avoid those?
You probably can't, all right? I mean, we were 6 emergent business units. We were all given $1 million and told we were exempt from IBM rules. And we discovered pretty fast we weren't. I still remember marketing saying I couldn't produce a brochure without consent, and it would cost me $100,000 to get their approval, which meant they were cost neutral, right? And then 3 months into the year, they took our money away or reduced it. And I didn't know I was meant to go and beg for it back, at which point I'd have been given more money and been told I was a good boy. So I got the US government to fund my project. And apparently there was a crisis meeting in research the next day because I'd set a precedent that companies would fund research and they couldn't have that. So there was actually a meeting to decide how to get rid of our unit. The director responsible for research confessed it to me drunk at a conference 3 years later, right? So I think, one thing that taught me is IBM actually, and the reason I was at the conference is IBM had decided that complexity was now in its plan. When I was developing it, it wasn't in the plan, so nobody wanted to know about it. And that's a culturally entrained habit. IBM has a culture which survives despite high turnover, because the stories you're permitted to tell are the stories that match the IBM existing culture. So if you want to disrupt that, you've got to move things outside. Yeah. And there's a whole body of methods and tools around that.
But what do you mean move it outside? I mean, because I know.
Well, IBM famously did it. Remember when they created the PC, which by the way was a horrible piece of hardware. The DEC Alpha was much better. They sent a group down to Florida and exempted them from all rules and processes and said, just get it out, and it worked. But IBM was so scared by that, they always refused to ever do it again. That was the irony on it. Yeah, but they created something outside the structure under different rule systems. There's a whole literature on this, by the way, which a friend of mine, Mac at Wharton, is one of the main guys on, South African. It's called intrapreneurship, not entrepreneurship. It's why Lean Startup, I think, is one of the 2 worst books ever published in Agile. Because he studies friends of his who succeeded and says what they did. Well, we did the same project when I was in IBM with Dorothy End of Harvard, and we studied companies who failed. Companies who failed in Silicon Valley did exactly the same things as the companies succeeded. It's just there's so many of them, some are bound to succeed anyway.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Dave. We have others who have questions up, their hands up. Benjamin, please go for it.
Howdy, Dave. I'm trying to do a safe recovery intervention at my current job. We're planning to use your AI Quick Sense to get leadership familiar with the possibility and the power of collecting narratives. Then I'm thinking about pivoting to your Agile Quick Sense. Just commentary from you on, is that the right move, or what would be my next step? Getting them familiar with the tool.
Yeah. But probably need to have a chat once you've got the results of the first one out. You might want to use a method, for example, like entangled trios to change the connectivity across the company.
Okay. All right.
Entangled trios is one of the most powerful methods I've ever created because it builds informal trusted networks across an organization within 18 months.
Okay.
And that improves communication channels. But we'll happily have a chat with you, just set up a meeting. Yeah.
Fantastic. I will circle back with Jules after we get this quick sense done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave and Benjamin. Tom, you're up.
Hi, Dave. I'm really excited about the role of, you pointed out, which Estuarine Mapping could have in the coaching market to move it out from that pathological psychotherapy towards bringing real rigor into it.
Yeah.
Could you point to, because now as you're opening SenseMaker towards these small pulses, will there be also a version of SenseMaker to support a journey for the coach and the coachee to use micro-narratives to really see the process you're getting along?
And if you're interested in an alpha test on that, you should get in touch. I mean, I originally pioneered that in my favorite ever client of all time, which was Chanel. So I did leadership development for Chanel. And by the way, that's glorious. I mean, they flew the Paris Ballet into the desert to perform for us specially. And we went through the diplomatic channel. And I have a white suit made for me by Lagerfeld because I had to fit into the environment. So I've never had a client that good. And I've probably never had one since. But what we did there is they journaled their daily experiences in any significant event into SenseMaker, and they shared that on the peer group. And we also now do that on 360. So if somebody who reports to you comes to see you, they tell a story about what happened. So they don't evaluate you, they describe what happened. Then they index it onto 4 triangles, all of which have positive values on it. So they can't say anything negative. So we get rid of the stress. But then you see the skews. Yeah. So what we're seeing is the coachee will actually maintain a journal in SenseMaker. They'll have tasks to interview people to gather stories, which will be indexed in supposedly neutral ways. Then you as a coach will have a conversation about that. And the Estuarine mapping element means to change the energy gradients of the environment they're working in rather than to change this themselves. And I think that's a really important shift. Yeah. But I say we're looking for alpha tests on the journaling at the moment. So if you're interested in that, get in touch. Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Thank you, Dave. We just have about a minute left, but we do have about four or five questions in the chat. Would you?
The wine isn't finished yet.
Okay, so are you ready for a rapid round? Then let me read the questions to you. What's the most compassionate way to help an org break up with safe or without triggering shame or denial? This is from Jennifer.
Conversion. Say because nobody in safe actually used everything in safe. They cherry picked. So what the Hexi kit allows you to do is say, what did you actually use? And then overlay it with transparency to say, this worked, this didn't work, right? What are you going to modify? So that's the process. Yeah. And again, the principle is, and you basically, safe was a Trojan horse. If we hadn't made it expensive and traditional, people wouldn't have bought Agile. I think this is a nonsense, by the way, but I'm prepared to dissemble with the best of them, right? So how do we move forwards from where we are without throwing it all out and starting again? Because that's the trouble. A new IT director will come in, they'll throw everything out and buy another framework, and you'll go through the whole cycle 2 or 3 years later. Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that question. Dave, here's the next question. If you want people to think differently, you have to create anomaly. What would you give us as a nice example? This is from Jelena.
Several. So, for example, entangled trios. So we'll put I'll give you an example. We put a bright young programmer together with a cynical older systems architect. I've yet to find a systems architect who isn't a cynical bastard. So that's good, right? The cynics care. Together with a user trained to talk to IT people, because it's easier to train users to talk to IT people than train IT people to talk to users. And we'll throw 15 of those trios at a problem for 3 months part-time. Now we're creating lots of micro anomalies because they'll see things differently. Yeah, that's one example. Another one is we gather stories from the workforce, which we can do with the quick sense I've gone. This is something, Benjamin, you might want to look at. We get a group of stories which have been indexed exactly the same way by employees. It's all got to be a group. We then present that to managers and say, index that the way you think the employees indexed it. Then we show them differences. And by the way, it's always very different. But they can't challenge the process. So it forces them to think differently. And we call this descriptive self-awareness. You should never, as a facilitator, be making any judgment about the behavior of anybody you're facilitating. You should put people in positions where they have to think and act differently. We had that, by the way, and we did a big, I've done our version of open space. I've done it, I think the biggest I ever did was 8,000 for the US Navy in a hangar down in Norfolk. But I've done them we did them for 300 or 400 Northern Territories, and the headmasters were dominating each table. So I asked each table to nominate or we said we had to have a very special working party to decide the key priorities for next day's agenda. So would each table nominate somebody from that working party? So guess what? The headmasters all got themselves nominated. I put them in a room and give them a second facilitator to give them meaningless tasks for 4 hours. And then they weren't in the groups anymore, so the groups came forward. That's a good example of complex facilitation. You never exercise your judgment. You just change the interactions. You change the actants.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Jorina, for the question. The next one is, if human knowledge is social, how does the conflict that increased desire for remote work and interactions? This is from Ryan.
I think it's a real problem because it's also the big problem with AI. AI is based on text and tokens. What you can write down is less than 10% of what you know. We know that when human beings make decisions, the way you make decisions is you do lots of little micro hallucinations. And by the way, AI bullshits, it doesn't hallucinate, right? So you do lots of little micro hallucinations, yeah, and they come from your own experience, third-party experience, pure imagination. And those entangle with sensory data, which can be oral, visual, and actually it can be smell. We know smell is a major factor in determining trust or not, and we know there are other things we don't yet understand. And then you do a first fit pattern match. So if people don't meet physically, they're not getting the sensory data they expect to get to make human social decisions. Yeah? So I think hybrid working works differently in different spaces. And there's also natural groups. This is from evolutionary biology. That's something with Dunbar's number, but Dunbar's grooming behavior. This is more substantial. We evolved to make decisions in sexual pairs, extended families, what are called deems, which are hunting groups, and macro deems, which where the hunting groups come together in winter. And there are limits on those. So in groups of 7 or less, you will find ways to compromise. Once it goes above 7, you won't. Yeah. So starting to understand social interaction, social presence, diversity. We're complex social creatures. We are not designed to be sat at a screen with a typewriter, although we can do it.
Thank you, Ryan, for the question. And the next question is, how do you account for luck in a system? This is from Oscar. Oh, serendipity. You make your own luck. We talk about managing for serendipity, and we have methods to do that. Yeah. Sometimes you'll get chance, but I mean, anybody knows statistically there's no such thing as a random number. I'm not sure there's chance. I think there's the ability to actually find your own luck, and the ability to spot something before somebody else. People attribute as luck, but that can be trained in people. It's called anticipation. Last two.
I prefer the word serendipity to luck. I think that's a better word.
Thank you. Last 2 questions, Dave. Lean startup, survivorship bias. Is that what it is? It's from Ian.
Well, it's just bad research. So if you don't study the negatives, you can't trust research on the positives. He also relies on what people tell him. All right. You should never rely on what senior executives tell you about what's going on in their company. I mean, that's absolutely bloody stupid. Anybody who knows anything about ethnography will know that. The worst book, the way, is Lacroix's Reinventing the Organization. That is truly terrible, because he basically has an evangelical mission, and he only selects the evidence which supports the mission and ignores the stuff from the same companies which disrupt it. But people love that stuff. Yeah, anybody who collects a bunch of platitudes together based on ill-conceived evidence will sell books at scale.
Thank you. Last question. Can you explain a little more about managing the present and how you map that with a view of the future? This is from Chris.
Okay, so there are 3 things you can do on that. This is the 3 A's model. So one is you map what is called the affordance landscape. That's what Estuarine Mapping does. So it says, what does the landscape look like? What is acted in it? What things can you actually change and what things you can't change, and what's the energy cost of that change? That takes 2 half-days, and that's a really important pre-project process before you start a project. It's a de-risking process. The other one is assemblage mapping. So an assemblage is a pattern of narrative which creates a belief system. Don't talk about memes. That's nonsense. That's the wrong metaphor. Yeah, it's a trope. It's a pattern of stories which are clumping together and creating an attractor mechanism. That will determine how people see the world. We can map that. That comes from our DARPA work. And the final one is change the agency. So the big project we're on at the moment is allowing role combinations of 6 or 4 roles combined with a completely anonymous role where nobody knows who it is. So we get the unseen observer to make substantial financial decisions in real time, provided they record the context, the decision, and the consequence in SenseMaker. And that can get, we know in the NHS, for example, we can get rid of 50% of the bureaucracy of medical decision making using that approach. So what you do is, instead of trying to work out in advance what decisions you should make, you create a process which can make decisions very quickly in context with fast feedback loops. So those are the 3.
Thank you, Dave. I think you've answered all the questions. If I've missed any questions, I apologize. Please do send them your way, and I'll have it sent to Dave, and he can answer it for us offline. Dave, we hope we helped you finish your wine, or if it is still there, then we can try.
And if people want to buy the Hexi kit, you can get them on our website. We're just launching the Estuarine kit, which is our second one. And there's the Scrum org kit will be available, I think, next month.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you all for joining us today. That's all what we have for today. You can watch the answers of those who have left on our YouTube channel. Thank you for joining, and see you again in another meetup session. Thank you, Dave.